Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Good morning, I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Here are the stories we're following today.
Karen, we begin with politics. Both Republicans and Democrats are saying they are worried about the potential for violence this election season. Bloomberg's Amy Morris reports from Washington.
The latest Bloomberg News Morning Consult poll finds half of swing state voters say they're worried about violence surrounding the presidential election. The poll results suggest Republicans, Democrats, and even more independents have misgivings about how the race will be received by a polarized electorate. 6 in 10 swing state voters, mostly Democrats, are worried about misinformation, and almost half, mostly Republicans, expressed similar concerns about foreign interference. In Washington, Amy Morris, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Amy, thank you. Well, voters headed to the polls in 4 states for primary elections in Georgia, Idaho, Kentucky, and Oregon. But one of the key races to watch was a special election in California for former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy's old seat. State Representative Vince Fong won that race with about 60% of the vote over fellow Republican Sheriff Mike Boudreaux. That brings Republicans' slim majority in the House to 218. As for the presidential race, 2 states held primaries at that level. Both President Biden and former President Trump added to their delegate counts. But in Kentucky, the president took just 71.3% of the vote. 17.9% of Democrats voted uncommitted. Biden fared better in Oregon. He won there with 88.2%. Former President Trump ran unopposed in Oregon, and in Kentucky, he won with 84.9% of the vote.
As for Georgia, Karen, the key races to watch there were for the prosecutor and the judge in Donald Trump's election interference trial, and they both came up winners. Bloomberg's Ed Baxter has that part of the story.
If prosecutor Fani Willis wins the general election in Atlanta's Fulton County, she will continue to prosecute the case. Willis last year obtained a sprawling racketeering indictment against Trump and 18 others. Willis, going in, had a very hefty fundraising pot and has run on a campaign that the future of the county should not be controlled by self-interested politicians. The county usually votes heavily Democratic. Judge Scott McAfee won an uncontested race. He was randomly assigned to the Trump case by the court. Ed Baxter, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Ed, thank you. Well, Donald Trump's defense team has rested its case in his hush money trial, with the former president opting not to testify. We get the latest with Bloomberg's John Tucker. John, good morning.
And Karen, his lawyers wrapped up their case after calling just 2 witnesses. The question of whether Donald Trump would testify had been hanging over the trial. He had said previously he would take the stand. In the end, it's likely his attorney strongly advised him to avoid testifying. Well, the jurors have been sent home until next week. The judge, Juan Merchan, told them to return on Tuesday for closing arguments, and he expects they'll start deliberating Trump's fate the next day. After 4 weeks, the panel has heard from over 20 witnesses, including porn actress Stormy Daniels and the prosecution's star witness, former Trump fixer Michael Cohen. The final witness for the defense was a lawyer who was fiercely criticized by the judge. As this case nears conclusion, Trump is facing 3 other prosecutions. In New York, I'm John Tucker, Bloomberg Radio.
And John, one of those is in Florida, and there is movement there. Prosecutors and defense lawyers in the classified documents case are due in court today for the first time since the judge indefinitely postponed the trial earlier this month. U.S. District Judge Aileen Cannon is scheduled to hear arguments on a request from the former president to dismiss the indictment on grounds that it fails to clearly articulate a crime and instead amounts to, quote, a personal and political attack against President Trump.
Well, we now turn to the markets, Nathan, and the big earnings report Wall Street has been waiting for. AI chipmaker Nvidia reports after the closing bell today. On Bloomberg's Tom Busby has a preview.
Well, Nvidia has seen explosive growth in its data center division and makes the H100 chip a so-called AI accelerator at the heart of the burgeoning artificial intelligence boom. It also recently announced a new platform called Blackwell that promises to be even more powerful. One question for investors, though, can it get enough supply from manufacturing partners Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing to keep up with demand? Consensus calling for total revenue of $24.69 billion, most of that from its data centers. Adjusted earnings per share, $5.65. Tom Busby, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Tom, thank you. And as we await those Nvidia earnings, stocks as a whole stand at all-time highs. The S&P 500 registered its 24th record close of the year. Max Kettner, chief multi-asset strategist at HSBC Global Research, tells Bloomberg that earnings have been driving stocks.
Look at the US, for example. The average earnings beat was around 8.5% to 9%. When we look at the 10-year average from before COVID, that was just around 4.5%. So we just came out of a reporting season where, the average earnings beat was almost twice as high compared to the pre-COVID history. Like, what's not to like with that?
HSBC's Max Kettner also says inflation is not yet fully defeated.
And Nathan, that's a sentiment we are hearing more and more from a chorus of Fed officials. Federal Reserve Governor Christopher Waller says he needs to see more positive news on inflation before cutting rates.
In the absence of significant weakening in the labor market, I need to see several more months of good inflation data before I would be comfortable supporting and easing in the stance of monetary policy.
And Fed Governor Christopher Waller added that April consumer price figures were a reassuring signal that price pressures are not accelerating. Policymakers have not adjusted the benchmark interest rate, now at a 23-year high, since July.
Well, Karen, inflation is also in focus in Europe. Let's get the latest on that with Bloomberg's Ewan Potts in London. Ewan.
Nathan and Karen, a sticky inflation shock for the Bank of England. Consumer prices in the UK rose 2.3% in the year to April, down from 3.2% the previous month. But that was a smaller drop than expected and mostly due to falling household energy bills. The core measure of inflation also dropped less than expected. And services inflation, something the UK Central Bank says it's watching closely, well, that barely budged, coming in at 5.9%. In London, I'm Ewan Potts, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Ewan, thanks. Well, Barclays is the latest firm that wants workers to return to the office. The bank is weighing whether to require U.S. workers to commute to company offices 5 days a week. Sources say some managers have started warning employees to prepare to commute daily.
And in another banking note, Karen, the UK has fined Citigroup almost $80 million for failures in its trading systems and controls. In 2022, a London staffer's fat finger trade caused a flash crash in European stocks. The blunder sparked a 5-minute worldwide sell-off, wiping out $326 billion at one point.
It's time now for a look at some of the other stories making news in New York and around the world. And for that, we're joined by Bloomberg's Michael Barr. Michael, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. Norway, Ireland, and Spain recognized a Palestinian state. Today's historic move drew condemnation from Israel and jubilation from the Palestinians. Israel ordered back its ambassadors from Norway and Ireland. Israel's foreign minister, Israel Katz, says that Ireland and Norway intend to send a message today to the Palestinians and the whole world: terrorism pays. Multiple people have died and at least a dozen were injured since a powerful tornado tore through a small Iowa town. The twister destroyed homes and businesses, shredded trees, and smashed cars. The tornado destroyed much of the small Iowa town of Greenfield. Iowa State Patrol Sergeant Alex Dinkler.
We're looking at just making sure that we have everybody accounted for.
Tuesday saw multiple tornadoes, giant hail, and heavy rain in several states. The National Transportation Safety Board will help investigate the sudden and severe turbulence that forced the emergency landing of a Singapore Airlines flight from London in Bangkok yesterday. There is at least one death and dozens were injured. This passenger was on the flight.
Honestly, I didn't understand at all the full scale of what happened until we landed. The dents that were made in the overhead luggage compartments and all the additional kind of paneling. Heads had literally pushed through and broken those plastic panels, and there's blood.
Today, Singapore Airlines CEO Goh Choon Pong says his company is deeply saddened by the tragedy.
A relief flight with 143 of the SQ321 passengers and crew members who were able to travel landed in Singapore this morning.
It's believed the 73-year-old British man who died had a heart attack. The White House announced this morning a new round of student loan forgiveness. According to the Biden administration, more than 1 in 10 Americans with federal student loans have been approved for some measure of debt relief under President Biden. The administration went on to say more than 160,000 borrowers will benefit from the latest package valued at $7.7 billion. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg. Karen.
Michael, thank you. Time now for the Bloomberg Sports Update with John Stashower. John, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. The Indiana Pacers have already had playoff upsets of the third-seeded Bucks and the second-seeded Knicks, and now trying to knock off the top-seeded Celtics in the East Finals. Indiana nearly won the series opener in Boston twice, rallied back from a double-digit deficit, had the lead in the final minute of regulation, but had two costly turnovers and didn't foul with a three-point lead. They let Jaylen Brown hit a game-tying three. Celtics won in overtime, 133-128. Tonight at the Garden, it's another East Final Game 1. Rangers and the Florida Panthers, who also got this far last year, went on to the Stanley Cup Final 2 years ago in this round. Rangers won the first two games with Tampa Bay, lost the next four. Chris Kreider remembers.
A couple years ago, we were kind of running on fumes. Two very emotional series, kind of coming from behind. And obviously, it was a fantastic experience. We really left it all out there, but I think we feel like there's a whole other level to what we can do this year.
Only the second playoff series ever between these teams, the other back in 1997. Yankees had their first two-game losing streak since late April at the stadium. Mariners hit 4 home runs, 2 by Dylan Moore, beat the Yanks 6-3. Gleyber Torres 3-run shot for the Yankee runs. Mets and Cleveland hit 3 homers but never led, came up short against the Guardians 7-6. Red Sox moved over 500, 5-2 win at Tampa Bay. Nationals lost to the Twins 10-0. Phillies beat Texas, moved 21 over 500. Rangers Suarez struck out 10. He's 9-0 with a 1.36 ERA. Many have wondered why, with advanced technology, football games still employ the old-fashioned chain gang to determine first downs. The NFL says it will experiment in the preseason with an optical system, and if it's successful, it will be used permanently. There'll still be a chain gang, but only as a backup measure. John Stashower, Bloomberg Sports. Karen, Nathan.
All right, John, thanks. So we have one other note on the Yankees. Sources say businessman Ray Chambers is renewing efforts to sell a minority stake in the ball club. Chambers is seeking a buyer for the holding in Yankee Global Enterprises, the Major League Baseball franchise's parent company.
Coast to coast on Bloomberg Radio, nationwide on Sirius XM, and around the world on Bloomberg.com and the Bloomberg Business app. This is Bloomberg Daybreak.
Good morning, I'm Nathan Hager. Let's get more now on our latest monthly Bloomberg News Morning Consult swing state poll, what it says about the mood of voters heading into a contentious 2024 election. For that, we are joined by Bloomberg News national politics reporter Gregory Cordy. Gregory, good morning. I guess first off, I should ask you where things stand in this latest poll. Have the dynamics changed in the 7 swing states between the president and former President Trump?
Good morning, Nathan. Well, yeah, I think there's maybe just a little bit of movement. This is a monthly tracking poll, so we parse it for just even microscopic moves. And what we see this month is that President Biden probably has increased his standing just a little bit with these swing state voters. Overall, if we look across these 7 swing states, that's Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. If we look across those states, we've gone from President Trump, former President Trump being up by 6 points to now being up by only 4. And the states that we are looking at most closely are those blue wall states, those northern industrial states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. President Biden continues to be very competitive there. They're all within a point or two. But former President Trump continues to lead in those other states in the Sun Belt. Except for Nevada. Nevada is the one sort of inscrutable state that we have this month. Trump was leading by 8 points last month. Now it's dead even. There's a high margin of error in that state, so not quite sure how to interpret that. But overall, this is a pretty good poll for Joe Biden if he's going to make up ground.
Now, in terms of the issues that we've talked about this time around, we've gotten some pretty interesting insights about what voters are concerned about heading toward November.
Yeah, you talk about the mood of the American people, and I'd have to say the mood is somewhat anxious about this election. Half of the swing state voters say they're concerned about the possibility of violence in the November election and its aftermath. We've seen protests over Black Lives Matter over the past few years, now pro-Palestinian protests, but also of course, January 6th. There's a lot of concern that if the other half of the country doesn't get its way, there could be violence, but also fears about misinformation, disinformation, foreign interference, election fraud. These are all sort of widely held, some more than others, by the American people. And it's just sort of reflective of going into a very contentious and polarizing presidential election. People sort of feel that tension.
Talking of the polarization, Gregory, do those concerns cut across party lines, or are they felt more by one side than the other?
What's interesting about that violence question is that they're felt pretty exactly equally by both Democrats and Republicans. And interestingly, independents who are seeing it on both ends have even higher fears of violence. On some of those other questions on foreign interference and on misinformation, a little bit more Republican or Democratic, depending on the question. But these are pretty broadly held fears across the American electorate.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Today, your morning brief on the stories making news from Wall Street to Washington and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed at 6 a.m. Eastern each morning on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning starting at 5 a.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg 1130 in New York, Bloomberg 99.1 in Washington, Bloomberg 106.1 in Boston, and Bloomberg 960 in San Francisco.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Plus, listen coast to coast on the Bloomberg Business app, SiriusXM, the iHeartRadio app, and on Bloomberg.com. I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak.